Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to my vegetable garden. Here we are at the 1st of July and I did not expect that I would be wearing a jacket today. But we had a rainstorm last night. It's kind of chilly and gloomy today, so hence the jacket. But today is the next vegetable garden tour of the season. We did one a month ago, and so I wanted to take you through so you could see how the plants are coming along and also point out a few things that are either problems or things that I need to take care of. So let's get started. Now I had a couple things I wanted to clarify before we get started. First of all, this is Wile E. Coyote. He's a coyote decoy. We bought him last year as a way to keep some types of birds away from a few of our vegetable crops. It worked initially, now they're just used to him, even though we move him around in the garden. But that's what he's doing here. He's kind of become a garden mascot. The other thing is, if you're new to my videos, first of all, welcome. And the other thing is I wanted to clarify that we live in Spokane, Washington. That's eastern Washington state, about 300 miles east of Seattle. We are in zone 5B, so we have cold winters and a fairly short growing season. Okay, now let's get down to business. Okay, we're going to go through the garden a row at a time, and this first bed has onions growing in it. On the back side, I've got a few rows of talon onions. These are ones that I started from seed using the winter sowing method. And if you're wondering what that's all about, just look on my YouTube channel for the video entitled Winter Sowing, and you'll see how that works. So they are doing really well, and then the row that is closest to you is a row of Stuttgarter, which is a long-keeping onion, and we started them from onion sets. In this next bed, I'm growing Swiss chard and beets. And if you think the Swiss chard plants, which are the closest to you, are looking atrocious, that's only because I just harvested a ton of leaves from them, so they're looking pretty pathetic. But they will put out a whole bunch more leaves, and so I want to make sure I harvest them on a regular basis so that we will have some to go through the winter months as well as enjoy right now. On the left side under the cover there is where the beets are, and they are coming along and they're starting to put on pretty nice roots. Now if you're wondering why floating row cover is over the bed, and I'm going to cover it right back as soon as I'm done here, that's because beets, Swiss chard, and spinach are very susceptible to leaf miners. They completely ruin the leaves, and so if I use floating row cover over the bed for the entire season, because the plants don't need to be pollinated, it keeps the adult fly from laying eggs on the leaves. I'm growing parsnips and carrots in this next bed, and they are doing really well. I was good about thinning them to about a 3 or 4 inch spacing so the roots have plenty of room to develop. And just to the left is the lettuce and sorrel bed. We have been eating a ton of salads, and I am very happy about that. They're doing really well. And if you're wondering about all those boards standing up, that's just to keep birds from slipping under that bird netting and getting into those nice greens. Next up is the rutabaga and kohlrabi bed. Everything is growing great, no pest problems, and I'm pretty much just keeping the bed weeded and keeping an eye on how the plants are doing. Now just for a little size perspective, I wanted to show you how much these fava beans have grown in the last couple of weeks. They have just shot up. And let me show you a close-up of some of the beans growing. Here are some of the beans. You can see they grow at kind of an odd angle, and they will get much larger before they're ready to be picked. So right next to the fava beans are our peas. These are a shelling pea called Green Arrow. And you can see there's a whole lot of pods on here. And if this is the first year that you're growing shelling peas, that's the kind where you take the little peas out of the pods, you want to make sure that you harvest them when the pods are rounded, but not kind of rubbery and really big, because then they'll be tough and you won't love them at all. So make sure that you pick them when the pods are rounded, and pick them frequently, because the more you pick, the more they'll bloom and produce more pods for you. Okay, so now we're heading into the second row of the garden, and this is the tomato zone. We've got some tomatoes growing in pots. We've got two kinds of paste tomatoes. Those are the kinds that you would use for making sauce and salsa. And then the row behind there is the Sun Gold cherry tomato, my favorite cherry tomato, and then 3 Chef's Choice orange tomatoes, which are great slicing tomatoes. So I want to show you something kind of odd. So these are those first 2 beds where I'm growing paste tomatoes. And the oddball thing that's going on with them is that they just don't look good. Some of their leaves are hanging upside down instead of right side up. They look kind of pale, a little bit anemic. They don't appear to have a disease, and they're just not growing as well as some of the other tomatoes. Now this happened to us with our paste tomato crop last year. They were growing in a completely different row of the garden, and we kept thinking, okay, is it too much water? Is it not enough water? Do they need fertilizer? What in the world is going on? And they finally did perk up, and they did give us a good crop last year. Well, these tomato plants are doing the exact same thing. And if you look at them, they just look kind of sparse. The coloration isn't all that great, and it's just a mystery. So last year we grew 2 rows of Gilberti paste tomatoes. This year, the row on the left here, this bed on the left, is Gilberti, and the row on the right is Federle. Again, both paste tomatoes, but that extra variety thrown in, and they're doing the exact same thing. So if anyone has experienced the same thing as this, I would love to hear from you and find out if you determined what the problem was. I just don't know if it's something with paste tomatoes or what, because I've grown other types of paste tomatoes and I've never had this problem until last year. And just to show you that, yes, there are some tomatoes that are growing beautifully and they look very healthy and they're doing great. So these are the Chef's Choice orange tomatoes that you're looking at. They've got some tiny little tomatoes on them so far. They're blooming, and they should be just fine, just like they were last year. So it's really just the paste tomatoes. Now this bed is also a problem child, and if you've seen my recent videos, you know exactly what the problem is. But just to reiterate, this is the Tuscan Napoli cantaloupe bed. It is a fantastic variety of melon. I've grown it for years, never had a problem. But we had an exceptionally rainy spring this year, and the soil just got too wet. So what happened is the first 4 cantaloupe seedlings in here died. It just was too wet for them. So once we figured that out, we let the soil dry out a bit, and I started some new seedlings and planted them. And they are starting to grow, but they are growing extremely slowly. Thank heavens 2 of the vines are vining out. They've got flowers on them, so maybe I will get 1 or 2 melons. Okay, here is a success story. So this is a pumpkin bed. I'm growing New England pie pumpkin because they make fantastic pies. And if you look closely on the ground, about 1/3 of the way from the right, you'll notice there's a little pumpkin growing there. But it is blooming, the vines are going crazy, and there's even a couple of volunteer sunflower plants on the left side, and I always like to have them because they bring in the pollinators. This is an arbor or an arch that we created with some cattle panels or livestock panels. And I'm mostly growing winter squash in these 2 beds. I also have a few cucumbers growing, and I just noticed there's a teeny little cucumber on one of the vines. But it's funny because I thought that these guys would automatically grow up the arbor, but no, you have to kind of train them and remind them that this is the way they want to go. But when we first were getting ready to plant these, I started seedlings indoors, and we debated about, okay, do we need to plant them on a certain side of each part of the arch? And so we decided that since that way is south, this way is north, what we should do is take into account that the plants will naturally want to grow to the south. So we planted these seedlings on the north side of the south part of the arbor, and these ones we planted on the north side of the north part of the arbor, thinking, okay, they're going to want to head south and maybe grow up and over that way. Well, no, they just want to go whichever way they want to go. It's really frustrating. But I just keep pointing them in the right direction. And I'm hoping when I show this to you next time, they will be up a lot higher and we'll have some fruits growing on the vines. This is the inside of our little hoop house, and it covers 2 raised beds. Now my husband Bill is the pepper aficionado and expert grower in the family, and so he is growing both sweet peppers and hot peppers. The plants are growing really well, and we even have a bunch of peppers growing on them. Let me find one for you. Here's a couple plants that are covered with peppers, and I would tell you which cultivars they are, but Bill uses a numbering system for his varieties. It's a very secret code. But hopefully later I can tell you what those are. This is the zucchini bed, and I'm going to be harvesting zucchinis for the first time of the season a little bit later today. So you'll notice these have a very light skin. This is Clarimore. We absolutely love this variety. It is very tender. It has a nice flavor to it. They're incredibly productive. On the back side of the bed, I'm growing a vining type of zucchini called Trombetta di Albenga. And just like with the winter squash, I have to tell it which direction to grow. But it will grow up this support and produce really funky, long, delicious zucchinis. Those look pretty good. The next bed is packed with more Stuttgarter onions. They are doing beautifully, and we are starting to harvest every other one so that the remaining ones have more room to form large bulbs. And then on the right is garlic and shallots in the foreground. And pretty soon we will get to harvest the garlic. Once the lowest 2 leaves turn brown, then it's time to harvest the garlic bulbs. We did recently harvest those little curlicues that grow on hardneck garlic, which are called garlic scapes. And so that way the bulbs will continue to grow until it's time to harvest them. If you leave the garlic scapes on the plants, then it sacrifices the energy of the plant for making a flower and seeds rather than growing large bulbs. So that's why it's important to cut it off. But when you do cut off the garlic scapes, make sure you eat them. Don't put them in the compost pile because they are absolutely delicious. Next up is everybody's favorite part of the vegetable garden, and that is our pole bean arbor. On it we're growing Musica pole beans, which are our favorite variety ever. And you can see they've mostly made it to the top center of the arch. So they're growing really well, they are blooming, and we actually have a few beans to pick already, so I'm pretty tickled about that. Now, the reason I grow the beans this way, if you haven't seen this before, is because I can stand under them when I'm harvesting them, so I'm in the shade instead of out in the heat of the sun during the summer. And they hang down on the inside, making it very easy to pick them. So I just love using this method, and it always is a feature in our garden. We move this arbor around through the garden each year because we practice crop rotation in order to prevent insect and disease problems. And I just love doing this. It's made up of 4 individual trellises, and it just works great. On the south side of the bean arbor, I'm growing leeks and more onions. This is definitely the year of the onion. And then we have pots here that have potatoes growing in them, and they are blooming now. That means that you can sneak a few new potatoes out of the pot. And so that's something I always look forward to doing. I leave the majority of them to harvest in the fall though. Now I've moved to what I jokingly like to call the south annex of the vegetable garden. But you can see there's a 16-foot bed here on the left and an 8-foot long bed on the right, and I am growing corn here. The variety is Sweetness Bicolor. We love this variety. And the interesting thing, if you look closely at them, and I'll just zoom in a little bit, look at the difference in the color of their leaves. On the right, they look a little bit sad, don't they? And on the left, nice dark green leaves, and they are growing beautifully. So why is that? Well, this time I know the answer, and that's because during the winter and very early spring, every time we ate fish, Bill buried the leftover fish parts in this bed. So that shows just what nitrogen will do. On the right bed, I was feeling badly that it never got any fish parts, and so I've been giving it some fish fertilizer since corn does use quite a lot of nitrogen, but they just haven't caught up to the other ones. Now let me explain what those poles are for. You're probably wondering what the reasoning is behind these poles. The problem is we live in a very windy area, and the wind mostly comes from the southwest. And corn has very short stubby roots, so if you have a bad windstorm, it can snap them off at the base. And that is one of the most depressing things you will ever find in your garden. I've been there. So what I do every year is I put up some supports around the perimeter of the corn beds, and once they grow up to a certain point, I'll use some jute twine and tie it all the way around. Ordinarily I do it lower, but I only just started doing it this season, and so I didn't have to do the low part. But anyway, I'll do it here, and then once the plants get up to about here, I'll do it one more time. And what happens is when you have a windstorm, instead of them being blown over and snapping at the base, what they do is they just move a little bit, and it's not significant enough to snap that base. So that's the method to my madness, and I have done this for years, and it has saved me a lot of heartache. Okay, we're almost done, guys, so hang in there about 2 more minutes. So in this bed, I'm growing broccoli and turnips and actually a few radishes. All of these are members of the cabbage family, and cabbage family crops are extremely susceptible to different kinds of insect problems. They get aphids, they get cabbage loopers, cabbage worms, or diamondback moth larvae, depends on where you live, and it's just very frustrating. So I have found that if you cover the crop with either floating row cover, or in this case, this is bridal veil netting, which is called tulle, you will create a physical barrier that keeps the insects away from the plants so that you won't have these problems. So this works really well for me. The plants are doing well, and they're just starting to form heads on the broccoli, and we've been eating the turnips. They're silky sweet, that's the variety, and they're really tasty. You can even eat them raw. In this final bed, I'm growing all kinds of melons, and I'm happy to say they are doing much better than the cantaloupe bed I showed you earlier. So in the foreground, I'm growing a fabulous honeydew melon called Ha Ogan. And the majority of the big vines from about 1/3 of the way out to the end of the bed are lambkin. I have never grown lambkin before. It's kind of like a cranshaw melon. And so I wanted to try it. I'm hoping I have great success with it. But the plants are blooming. I haven't noticed if there's any little melons on them yet, but they're doing really well. They're in a nice sunny spot, and so I have high hopes. Well, that concludes the July vegetable garden tour. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned a tip or two along the way. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I'll see you next week. Happy gardening.